It was amazing, thank you very much. I understood about 70% of it. The 30% I didn't understand is probably the critical 30%. I mean, the only thing I'd make a comment on is that, when I look at what's going on now, there's two sort of parts to it to me. There's the stuff that's happening that's, once off happening and that can recover, and there's the stuff that's happening that's a systemic shift, that's a paradigm shift, that once it's happened, it's going to be very difficult to put the genie back in the bottle. And, the sort of things that I'm talking about, obviously, is the cut-off of the overseas capital markets, the impact that that has. And we're beginning to see, it's quite concerning, we're beginning to see that the state may well take the view, no need for, of course I work for an international accountant, so I would take this point of view, but no need for international accounting, because if the foreigner isn't playing with us, we're not going to play with the foreigner. That works in the short term, but once you get the other side of this, and hopefully we get the other side of it quite quickly, you're going to need to access leverage to be able to come out of the crisis. And one of the things that's really a concern to me is not sort of where we are now, but how we then fund the recovery and how we then access the markets and grow out of this. So when I look at sort of developments and say, well, where can this go to? Obviously the good news is if the oil doesn't fall to the extent that people thought, if it starts to bounce back, so you get more economic activity. But some of these systemic things won't come back easily. And they may well have a bigger long-term impact on the economy. Shall we spend half an hour on that? No. Basically, I ran a bunch of banks. I spent 25 years at Citibank. I was a crisis manager in about 4 countries. So, and then of course I've enjoyed Russia for the last 20 years. So I have some sort of direct, visceral experience of crisis. And what we'll do here, and I'm going to keep it as short as I can because it's 10 o'clock at night. This comes from my leadership course. Let me just, there's 2 parts to this. One is leadership and the other is crisis management. Leadership, I spent quite a lot of time thinking about what is leadership. And basically leadership comes down to 2 things. One, the skills that you can be taught. I can teach you how to communicate, I can teach you how to run a meeting, I can teach you various skills. And that might take some time, but I'll pass on my skills. You then have those leadership skills. But that isn't leadership. Leadership is the combination of the skills that I can teach you and the characteristics that you develop yourself. And those characteristics that you develop yourself come in daily. They get you live your life day by day. You develop your characteristics day by day. But I came across an idea, a theory, which I really liked, which is that we have intense experiences, crucible experiences. And these crucible experiences don't change us a little bit, they change us a lot. And these crucible experiences come in 3 varieties. They come as a new experience that you've never done before, and it forces you out of your comfort zone, and it makes you stronger if you survive it. The second one is a lot more difficult, which is reversal. That's when you've just had the big promotion, everything's looking great, there's a blue sky, sun shining, whoops, you just hit the wall. You have some major reversal, and that reversal causes you to doubt yourself, that reversal puts you inward, you start blaming other people, and you go into a kind of shell, and then if you're not careful, you don't learn the lesson of failure. And I actually teach a little sort of masterclass on failure. I'm one of the world's most successful failures. In that I have been through this failure routine a number of times, and I've really had to think about what can you do to survive this period, how do you take the most out of it. And the final crucible is a suspension crucible where things in the future aren't like things in the past. And if you spend your whole time looking in the rearview mirror, it's not a good way to drive a car, and it's not a good way to live your life. So that suspension crucible is how you move on with your life. And this is just a slide from that part of my teaching, which is, well, here are some characteristics of leadership. Actually I started, there's quite a lot of them. I started with a short list, and basically during the course of the last year and a half, I've actually been able to add to it. And if you look down this thing, there's some things that come out. Well, one is that if you don't have integrity, you don't have a voice. Nobody's going to listen to you if you don't have integrity. Then you can sort of, it's like a smorgasbord. You don't have all of these all the time. You don't have, everybody doesn't have all of these. But if you look at some of these things like courage, perseverance, energy, empathy, these are things that are actually pretty much necessary if you're going to be able to connect. Big difference, and I learned this firsthand Big difference between crisis management, you do this, you do that, you do the other thing, and leadership, follow me because this is where I want you to go, is absolutely fundamental to the shift between, frankly, a directional management and an influential leadership. So that's a course that will take about, there we are, that took 4 minutes, and normally I spend about a day and a half on it. So let's move to what constitutes a crisis. I mean, I think, why is it important to know when a crisis starts? Well, there is a shift in the way that you deal with issues. So if you don't know when a crisis starts, you can't start to shift. And one of the most important things that I would say about crisis management, I describe it the following way. You're in a canoe, it's a sunny day, you're on a river, you're with a friend and a bottle of wine. The birds are singing, the sun's out, and you're in the middle of the stream. Well, you have another glass of wine, the canoe starts to get a little faster, the birds are still singing, the sun's still out, and the canoe starts to accelerate. There's a point in time, but then a little later you hear a background sound. You're not sure what it is, sun's still shining, birds still tweeting, and then you'll go over the waterfall. And if you don't paddle to the shore early enough, if you don't have forward-looking radar, then your ability to react to these changing circumstances is really quite severely impacted. So one of the most important parts of crisis management, frankly, is to call the crisis early. And one of the things about business is that business doesn't happen in a vacuum. Business happens because you do one thing and your competitor does another. If you can spot the crisis ahead of your competitor, you can position yourself, you increase your pricing if you're a bank, you make the covenants tighter, you reposition your security, that stuff will get you through the period of the crisis. If, on the other hand, you do that and there is no crisis, you've just lost market share, you've just damaged your business model. So this business of what is a crisis is pretty important. Normal outputs do not create historical inputs. And there's unexpected events with significant impacts across multiple sectors. I mean, you can spend a lot of time about the black swan, what's a black swan, the 4 quadrants of risk. Black swan is simply something that hits you from nowhere, that you weren't prepared for, that you couldn't forecast, but that you have to react to. And that whole concept, that whole industry that the guy Nassim Taleb has built is basically nothing more than be flexible, be adaptive, be reactive, and don't try and forecast the unforecastable. It's a waste of time. These shifts in capital, one of the reasons I love this period, the reason I loved a good crisis, I still love a good crisis, is that things don't happen at the margin. You don't fight for 1 or 2% market share. You grab 10%, you lose 10%, you run out of capital, you take over the next bank. I mean, this is a really great time if you're well prepared. So you can't forecast a future event, so it's difficult, and you have multiple scenarios. So, and because this thing is shifting around, you haven't got a steady state environment. By the way, normal inputs do not create historical outputs. It's also where, things that normally happen stop happening. It isn't just that something new happens, it's sometimes things that happened in the past don't happen in the future. And this thing about forced revision of tactical and potentially strategic, tactics is how you get through the day. Strategy is what you do as a CEO looking over the horizon. And the problem about a crisis, which is very interesting, is that normally, I have a sort of mantra, don't let the urgent crowd out the important. If you let the urgent crowd out the important, by the time the important becomes urgent, it's too late. You can't deal with it. So what you have to do is you have to have this considered approach which balances the things you need to do today with the long-term things you need for the future. The trouble about a crisis is if you're dead tomorrow, it doesn't really matter what your medium-term plan is. So this crisis forces you to deal with both. And the issue that you run into time and time again is how do you balance taking care of the urgent tactical stuff without losing long-term strategic plans. And one of the things that's clear is we all view the world through past experience. So if you've not been through one of these crises before, then you'll react in a different way. You'll actually sort of freeze. If you've been through a crisis 2008, 2009 and you think, oh, here we are again, then you use your experience from 2008 and 2009 and you think you can forecast this crisis, well, it's completely different. So this business of how you view it and what your experiences are drives how you act in the crisis. So here are some things about a crisis, you know, time frame, short or long term, depth, how deep. This is what Bloomberg asked me in 2008. They said, is it a V, is it a W, is it an L? And I said, it's a Q. And there was this kind of like, what? I said, well, I have no idea what it is. You know, if I knew what it was, I'd make a lot of money. I wouldn't tell you. But the profile is you have to take a view, because, you know, one of the things I want to get across here is liquidity is the equivalent of oxygen 40 meters down. So if you are 40 meters down, you know, you're scuba diving and you run out of oxygen, you know, you're done. If you run out of, if you don't run out of oxygen, the guy next to you runs out of oxygen, hey, he's yours. So this issue of how you forecast, how deep, how long, how wide the crisis is, will allow you to position your liquidity and will allow you to take maximum advantage. But be careful. If you start pulling in your receivables, pushing out your payables, you start dicking around with your banks, you know, your constituents will remember. And you've got to maintain the relationships during this period, otherwise you'll find that where you thought you had access to liquidity disappears. So this extent, systemic industry company, you know, this is how wide it is. Can you get away from it? And the tactical I've just talked about, and the precedent I've also just talked about. So here's what happens. You do nothing. Initial shock, rabbit in the headlights. I mean, I wrote a little piece in the Moscow Times which was how to have a good crisis. And actually what I meant was how to have a really bad crisis because you do all the wrong things. And the first thing that I recommended you do in that situation is, you know, if you don't have a plan, just hope for the best. And if that doesn't work, hope a little harder. That is not a plan. And this idea that, and many people get into this situation, they freeze, the first person to move, you know, it's like in a gunfight, you know, the first person to move wins. I've talked about that, that historic measurement systems may not work. You know, the fact if you take the view that the past is no longer a predicator for the future because the dynamics have changed, then obviously what you've got to do is you've got to look back at your historic measurement systems and say, are these relevant given the changed parameters? Danger of information overload. You know, people, I mean, one of the things that happens in a crisis, that has to happen in a crisis, is that the CEO, the leader, has to shorten the lines of communication, because the key critical success here is how quickly can you absorb the new information, how quickly can you digest it, create a plan and execute the plan. And that means that you're focusing a lot of information onto a small decision-making platform, and that platform has to react very quickly. The trouble is that if you try and get too much information coming in, then you end up with information overload. And the other part of that problem is if you don't have the information coming in, and your historic measurement systems don't work, you may well miss the critical piece of information. New risks replace old, and they change the existing risk horizon. And stress always causes overreaction, which is, you know, it's just one of the facts of life. This is what happens a lot, is that you're either in denial or you blame everybody else. So here is, I'm going to try and get this done in 5 minutes, by the way. What actions are needed to minimize impact? First of all, make sure you get relevant information, and back to the point about making sure that what you're doing here is that you're trying to feed in new information. Understand the key drivers of the new reality, and this business of triage, which is what can you change, what can't you change? What will shift your ability to react? Creating a small steering committee, operation management, PR processes. The problem with this is, you know, that steering committee may not include people that think that they should be included. So you actually end up with some morale issues because people suddenly find themselves on the outside of the room. But you have to keep that as a small group. And one of the things that, I did do crises in Kenya, Egypt, Norway, Italy, and the UK before I got to the Russian market. And one of the things that is absolutely clear to me is people actually need a trigger. And when they hit the trigger, you need to say, it's a trigger, do something. Because the natural reaction is, oh my God, we hit the trigger. Hey, can we wait another week because maybe it'll get better. And that's what you see happening. And if you force the change, you have a much better chance of survival. External relationships more important than ever, pretty obvious. How often you revise the scenarios. In a crisis, you have to be much more flexible, you have to be much more prepared to rethink your scenario planning. And, and this is what I did at HSBC in 2008-9, communicate. People are very uncertain, people are You know, people get nervous, people get very concerned. And by the way, when you communicate, don't make the mistake of the following. Trust me, everything will be all right next week. You know, because you go into trust me, everything will be all right next week, and then the following week you walk in and it's like worse. Now what are you going to say? You've got to be realistic. As you communicate, you have to be able to communicate in a realistic way, creating realistic expectations. Don't procrastinate, act, take control of the information war, and the central role of the CEO is obvious. Oh, by the way, if everybody's there on a sales target and you've suddenly hit a crisis and you're going to try and reduce your exposure, it might be a good idea to change everybody's KPIs. I ran into a situation where we're in a commercial bank, people had $1 billion asset target, and the first thing I did was stop the business. Obviously a lot of people were extremely upset about that, but the fact is, what you save in principle, you never make in interest what you save in principle. Never forget that. Business doesn't happen in a vacuum. What you do is what you do versus the competition. So if you analyse the approach of the competition, and you can take short-term and medium-term perspectives. Maybe you want to hire their people. Maybe you want to do a price war at the beginning of the crisis to drive them out of business. Also, you have to spend some time after the event to say what worked, what didn't work, and what were the lessons we learned. Here's what determines the winners and losers, in my opinion: the reaction time and ability to adjust to new realities. The people who are slowest are the ones that get run over. Financial resources, that's the oxygen. If you have it, you're in good shape. If you don't have it, you're 40 meters down. Relationship with constituents. And by the way, one of the points about relationships with constituents is relationships don't get created at the time you need them. Relationships get created over time. So don't think that suddenly you can pick up some guy that you haven't spoken to for a year and say, hey buddy, how about helping me out? It's too late. And that's the reason why it's very important to create and maintain, water and care for relationships on an ongoing basis, because when you run into these situations, that's when you need them. That's very important. Luck. There's parts of this where no matter how good you are, you're going to be reliant on what happens as just an outside factor. Talked about the competitors, maintain core competences. If and this is difficult, if you are going into a crisis, and I just told you that you need liquidity because it's oxygen, how deep do you cut your staff? How quickly do you reduce your R&D? How much training do you pull out? These are all questions that you have to balance. How much is the need for liquidity versus what is the danger that when this thing returns, you will have lost your core competencies. Flexibility, your ability to rethink the way that you're doing your business in the new environment and leadership. Thank you very much. That's the speed course. Are there any questions or any comments? Or are you all thinking it's 10 past 10, it's time to go home? Or have a drink? Any questions? No? Yes?
Well, you told the story about swimming on the canoe with drinking wine and birds singing. So what would you do if you just some meters before the waterfall? So
well, you know what happens if it's a few meters before the waterfall? I jump out of the canoe and hope for the best, and that's the best you can do. The whole point of the story is, it's not a very complicated point, but if you have forward-looking radar, you will take action at a point where you still have options. If you're too close to the crisis, if you're too close in, it's recovery. It's not, there's things you could, it's like a portfolio as a banker, that you can get, the best way of avoiding principal fails, avoiding writing off your portfolio, up your pricing and get some other stupid banker to pay you out. I mean, that's by far and away the best remedial plan that I know. So that's a perfect case where if you see ahead far enough, you take action, that action causes your competitor to swallow a loss, perfect result. So it's just about, the only point of the story is, take action as soon as you can. I have to tell you though, that you can be wrong. I mean, when I was running Citibank in Puerto Rico, of all places, I called the fact that Puerto Rico was going to go bust. The only problem was I called it 10 years before it happened. So a number of things happened. One, I lost my job. And two, Citibank went on to make quite a lot of money for the next 10 years, although they gave it all back at the end because they had a big exposure. So, any other questions or comments? Okay, I think everybody's had enough here. I think it's 10 past 10. Anyway, thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Well, as you see, we choose professors to strategically, since you know we have Russians and foreigners, we have professors from academia and invited professors from business community. So now you feel like, what is it, studying MIF? And talking about the topics, obviously now we have to deal with the crisis, and this is what Oleg has been talking about economic crisis in Russia. Stewart was talking about dealing with crisis, and this is the question which you must decide for yourself what to do during the crisis. To invest in yourself, yes or no, how to invest, study or not, way to study. We try to give you, our solution, and I hope to see you all at MIF next year. Thank you very much for coming. So if you have any questions, contact us, write to us, call us.